Lord be with you.
And with us.
Let us pray. Lord, thank you for another Sunday to worship you, another day to read your word, another day to enjoy fellowship with one another. We ask that you would open our hearts and minds, help us to hear what you would have to say to us, help us to understand how we might obey you more fully, and leave this place today with a greater understanding of your love and of our calling in this world. We thank you for your love for us. We thank you for the gift of your Son, and we pray all this in his name. Amen.
Amen.
We are in chapter 6. We have been plugging away. Thank you for your patience as we work our way through Luke, because I know it's tedious walking through a book like this.
You have
This is nothing.
I know you guys have done several year-long
I've seen a
studies.
year long. Yep.
Well then good. You guys are just ready to have a good time.
Yeah,
Walk in the park. You're used to it. And it's good. It is, for as difficult as it can be, it really is good for us to return to a book over. We're such distractible people. We want to move on to the next thing, or maybe I'm just talking about myself. But it's tempting to move on to another book and see what's going on in other places. But to really plug into a single book, to read it from beginning to end, and to have to sort of have that knowledge of the whole meaning of a book is so much more rich and full than just reading excerpts from various different books. Reading excerpts is not a bad thing, but it's helpful to really plug into a book and see what an author is trying to do over the span of an entire book, even a long book like the Gospel according to Luke. So we won't do a full-fledged review at this point. You guys know well enough that Luke is talking about the upside-down kingdom of God. You know that Luke is talking about healing a lot. Luke loves to talk about healings. Luke loves to talk about how people on the margins of society are coming in and being included in the kingdom of God in a special way and are finding hope in a special way. And in chapter 6, we're actually going to begin Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, which is analogous to the, sort of corresponds with the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5. And there are some interesting differences. And again, at the very beginning of our study, we talked about how different gospel authors are trying to make different theological points. They're all being faithful to the same story, but they're making different theological points to help us understand Jesus' life and teachings in a more robust way. So you'll notice, for instance, when we get to the Beatitudes of Luke's accounting, there's some slight differences with what we're used to from Matthew. So we'll get there. Before we get there, though, we have to handle one more story of healing and controversy. Remember, we've had these several scenes of controversy where Jesus is running up against the Pharisees, and people are kind of calling him out on different things. So we had, for instance, let's see, where did that begin? Jesus healing a paralytic in chapter 5. Actually, even before that. Maybe it really was that. I think Jesus healing the paralytic in verse 17 of chapter 5 is where we first see, is where this series of conflict begins.
About the leper.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to see if there was controversy in the healing of the leper.
No.
I mean, it's a good story. It has its own things going on. But it seems like in the healing of the paralytic is where we first see this conflict begin, where the Pharisees are sort of looking at him with their glasses on, they're sort of looking down, trying to catch him. And in the calling of Levi, he's hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. They call him out about that. There's the instance where the disciples are walking along on a Sabbath and they grab some grain and they get the chaff off and they're popping it in their mouth and eating, and they call him out on that. What are you doing? What are your disciples doing? And then I think we finished last Sunday with Jesus, Lord of the Sabbath. That's right. That was the plucking the grain, was the beginning of chapter 6. So now we're at chapter 6, verse 6. The healing of a man with a withered hand. I'll go ahead and read this for us, actually. On another Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and was teaching. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. It's hard to tell exactly what kind of ailment this was, but some kind of paralysis, right? This we could imagine this as several different things. What would you think, Kathy? What would you're in the medical world? What would you think if somebody were to describe a man with a withered hand? What would you
Probably
think?
born that way.
Probably born that way.
Just a genetic thing.
Yeah, the genetic thing. So this guy's hanging out, and he's at the synagogue. He's there for the Sabbath service. And look at verse 7. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. Do they have this guy's best interest at heart at all? No. They're hoping that he will heal him, not because they're interested in this man's well-being, clearly. It's because they want to catch him on something.
Do you think Jesus, knowing their hearts, intentionally does it on the Sabbath?
Yes, absolutely.
He wakes up and goes, I'm going to do something today.
Absolutely. I definitely think so. I definitely think so.
What was the philosophy, though, that you wouldn't want to do something? I mean, I can maybe understand the corn and all that kind of stuff,
Sure.
but I can't understand the healing. It certainly doesn't fit with the way we think today.
So it all comes from this tradition, this Jewish tradition. So they had the prohibition against working on the Sabbath, and there are some sort of more specific instructions in the Old Testament about what that looks like. But then on top of that, there was also this kind of rabbinical tradition of what that should and should not look like, with all kinds of details. And you see that even in sort of contemporary Judaism, things that are not necessarily commanded in the Torah, but are sort of expansions on that as a, and to view it from a charitable lens. It was perhaps these additional rules were intended to be more faithful to the law, but clearly at this time among these Pharisees, it was not that. It was a kind of oppressive weight on the people. And we see, of course, Jesus comes with a better teaching, a more authoritative teaching on the purpose and intention of the Sabbath. What does Jesus say about the Sabbath? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Clearly that had gotten topsy-turvy. Somewhere along the line that had gotten mixed up in such a way that that people would even get their feathers ruffled by someone being made whole again. Clearly something in the system is broken. Clearly, somewhere along the line, something has been turned upside down and corrupted, and Jesus is going to set that right. So let's see what he does. Yes, I do think he knows I think he knows that he's going to start stirring up some trouble. Jesus isn't doing these things and I didn't know you were going to be mad at me, right? So he knows, which is good in The Chosen. Again, we keep coming back to The Chosen. It's not, The Chosen is not the gospel, right? But it's a fun watch, and it's got some good stuff in there. And something that they highlight in some of those episodes is Jesus' intentionality in stirring up trouble. That he's like, we're gonna, come with me. We're gonna go do this thing. It's gonna cause some trouble. But of course, his intention is not. Yeah, it's to get people to think. His intention is always for people to come into a greater understanding. And he's willing to stir the pot in order to do that. Like we said, the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. A quick comment, this is something that a commentator pointed out that I thought was interesting. What Jesus does here, he doesn't even touch the man. What does he do? What is Jesus' action right there?
Talking to him, giving him
He talks.
yeah, he just talks.
Is speaking prohibited on the Sabbath? No, clearly not. I mean, Jesus is pretty beyond reproach here, even according to the standards of the Pharisees. And Jesus said to them, again, knowing their thoughts, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them all, he said to him, again, only speaking, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Again, very evident that something was broken in the system, right? The intention of the Sabbath as a period of reflection and enjoying the providence of God, the life of God, bringing someone into wholeness and restoration is completely compatible with that original intention of the Sabbath. The Pharisees are getting stirred up because they have created this system which has become oppressive to the Jewish people. And what Jesus is doing runs against the grain of this man-made tradition. And his teaching on the Sabbath is bringing people back to what was originally intended. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a gift. We'll even see in other places, I think maybe in other, I forget where exactly this happens. It may even be in other gospel accounts of the same story where Jesus points out the hypocrisy of, you would go and, if your animal fell in a well on the Sabbath, you'd get it out, right? Yeah, of course. But here's a human being who is, in a much worse state than being trapped in a well. Should I not bring him out of that and bring him into wholeness? So, what a testament that is to not just to the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, but to our tendency as human beings to get even God's teaching out of order and twisted in such a way that we put burdens upon ourselves rather than enjoying God's intention for us.
See, there's a note on my study Bible for verse 9 where he asks them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm?" And it says, Jesus had acted out of compassion to heal the man with the withered hand. His opponents, however, finding themselves in a dilemma, refused to answer. I know Jesus often asks kind of rhetorical, but maybe in this case he actually was wanting them to answer.
I think that absolutely, because it's kind of funny that they don't answer the question.
Because he said, verse 10, and after looking around at them all, he said to him. So I guess he was looking and no one said anything.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right. They were, and he knows what's going on in their hearts and minds, and he's looking around, knowing their internal grumbling. They're all just kind of, they have the steam coming out of their ears, and Jesus knows what's happening in their hearts and minds, and says, "Well, let me ask you a question. Is it lawful to do good, or is it lawful to harm on the Sabbath?" And the obvious answer is to do good.
Did it say how many people there were? Because I know with a bigger crowd, that's when it's more rhetorical, I suppose, when you're not literally, there aren't enough to respond.
That's a good question. It depends on, I'd have to do some digging on how many people attended a synagogue service at that time. And I guess it probably depends on the town as well.
Right.
I feel like there may be parallel accounts of this that tell us where this happened. Yeah, it's hard to say exactly whether or not Jesus was hoping somebody would speak or not.
Well, verse 11 says that they discussed it with one another.
Yeah.
You know, that seems to imply that they didn't speak up during
Yeah. They probably got together afterwards and said, "Hey, what are we going to do about this?"
They were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus, but
Yeah.
that was clearly an after the fact or
Yeah.
private thing with the
Yeah, for sure.
Pharisees.
And of course, I mean, this is a story, right? Luke is this is a full narrative. What foreshadowing that kind of language is. They discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. You know, even here, relatively early on, we're seeing that Jesus is heading towards more persecution, more oppression, even death. He's heading towards the cross. Any other thoughts about that quick passage? What should we do to avoid the Pharisaical thinking?
Mind our intentions. You know, they were all over power and control and,
Yeah.
and admire me and look at all that I'm doing. You know, we
Right.
need to turn that away from ourselves and look out.
But surely we don't do that anymore, though, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the Lord, and what a great Lenten thing to ask the Lord, show me where I have gone astray in this way, because we have all kinds of blind spots in our lives, in our hearts, and the Lord will show us what's going on in those blind spots, and might not always like what's going on in those blind spots, but He'll show us, and we have to be ready to accept correction. And we can know full well that the intention behind that correction is not just to chastise us, but to bring us to a better place. Isn't Jesus' teaching better than the Pharisees' teaching? Yeah, it's way better. It's life-giving. Jesus will always bring us into a place of fuller life. It may be painful getting there, but that's always His intention.
Can you see this happening in today's age? If the Pharisees had come out on top, they were the leaders today.
Yeah.
You couldn't go to the hospital.
Yeah, right.
They close on Sunday. What a strange world.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that is strange. And the Pharisees. So you read about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees were a much bigger group. Both of them were powerful. The Sadducees were a small group that had a lot of money, and they had a voice in the conversation. But the Pharisees really kind of won out. And even contemporary Judaism is in some ways a descendant of the sort of teaching tradition of the Pharisee party. That's not like knocking. That I don't mean that in any kind of pejorative sense. But the Pharisees maintained their teaching tradition through the centuries, and it started before the first century, of course. You can do all kinds of studies about the different groups within ancient Judaism and where that started. A lot of it has to do with the exile. There were exilic. There was an exilic Jewish school. There was a school in sort of northern Africa. There's all kinds of interesting stuff that you can go down a rabbit hole with.
Well, to Kurt's point, all faiths and denominations have a range of strictness or fundamentalism or other, we all have different sects or different denominations or different groups that and some of them will oppose all medical care or will oppose, doing anything or leaving your house on the Sabbath. There's all sorts of, they can make up all sorts of rules, and I think we all just have to find what's comfortable for us as
and we have to
worshiping God.
And we have to keep seeking. We have to keep sitting at the feet of Jesus to hear what He has to say. Because if you think, we shouldn't think that Jesus is just a less strict teacher. In fact, in a lot of ways, He ups the ante. So, again, we'll get to Sermon on the Mount / Sermon on the Plain. You've heard that it was said, "Do not commit adultery." I tell you, even if you look lustfully at a woman, you've committed adultery. So he, in some way, I mean, he has raised the bar of holiness. It's not that Jesus is just sort of a like, hey guys, let's all kind of chill out a little bit. You know, that's not Jesus' intention. His calling on us is complete holiness, right? And he'll bring us there. But the path, that path is a life-giving path. It's difficult, but it's a life-giving path. Jesus is always about inviting us into greater life. And he won't give us any leeway on accepting anything less, if that makes sense.
Well, there is a path to forgiveness. They don't
Of course.
lop our hands off.
That's
gouge our eyeballs out.
Yeah. It's very strict. It's Jesus' teaching is a strong teaching, but it is always infused with grace and forgiveness. It's always right there. Yeah, absolutely. It's good stuff. Well, let's take a look at it, because we're about to, in just a second, we're going to get into his a big teaching chunk, which will be fun to look at. Just his. We've been doing a lot of narrative stuff in Luke. We've been looking at stories about Jesus. Now we're going to get into Jesus' actual teaching in just a second. First, we're going to deal with these apostles. Would somebody read verses 12 through 16 real quick, that little calling paragraph?
These days, go ahead.
Go ahead.
You can read it at the same time.
Now you go ahead.
All right. In these days, he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor.
Yeah, pretty eclectic group there. And of course, it's always helpful to, the language can be confusing, right? All of the apostles are disciples, but not all disciples are apostles, right? And so we have this large, the way Luke paints this, we have this large group of, Jesus has a big following. He has all these disciples, these people who are sitting at his feet and learning, following him around. And Jesus calls these 12 men out from that group and commissions them to be not only disciples, but also apostles. What does it mean to be an apostle? One who is sent. Jesus has a special mission for these guys. He's going to give them special authority to go out and do his work in the world. And there's lots that we could say about this. Of course, the number 12. What are some other things we associate with the number 12? Tribes of Israel, right?
Months of the year.
Months of the year. But there's a certain fullness to it. Sure, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's certainly, the tribes of Israel are, what Jesus is doing is renewing the life of Israel. It's not an accident that Jesus picks 12. And you're right, and yeah, there's a fullness to that number. And like I said, it's an eclectic group of people. Jesus, among this group of people, we have we've talked about this before, but we have someone like Matthew, a tax collector, and then Simon, who was a zealot. Zealots were people who were in favor of a military uprising against people like Matthew, who would corroborate with their Roman overlords. So Jesus calls together the most unlikely ragtag group of people. Do you think they got along all the time in the camp? I doubt it. I highly doubt it. I bet there was some drama among the camp. Some disagreements about how to obey Jesus and what it means to be a Jesus follower.
Do you think he called them out verbally in front of everybody, or do you think he did that sort of privately, individually? I mean, how do you think he physically did that?
That's a good question. I mean, so if we're just going with what Luke tells us here, it's hard to say. Yeah, it could go either way. There were certain I mean, as far as his calling people to be at least disciples, that was certainly a public thing. So, for instance, with Matthew, aka Levi, we get the sense that it was kind of in broad daylight in front of everybody. Like, hey, Levi, behind the tax collector stand, get on out of there. You know, it was not, Jesus didn't approach him privately. As far as the calling of the 12 to be apostles, I'm not 100% sure. I don't know. Yeah, we
My
should.
Bible says he called his disciples to him.
Yeah.
So they were all there.
Oh, interesting.
A larger group, yeah, I think he called it a larger group, and
Oh, I see. Yeah, he
And
called.
he
chose
picked them out
from
of
them
that
12.
That's true.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's a
that.
good point. Yeah, he called his disciples, so that does sort of conjure up the image of him calling everybody together, and chose from them 12. So maybe it was kind of a public thing. That's interesting.
I was
So-
just wondering because he may have wanted them to know that they needed to stand apart, but not only that, he needed the others to
Yeah,
know
yeah.
that they got special.
Yeah, and plus, it's not going to be a secret going forward. Everybody's going to know that these guys are given special authority, and yeah. So maybe it was public in order to show the rest of the group, hey guys, these are leaders among you. You know, yeah. It could.
all right, I fear I might derail you and keep you from getting to your.
No, you're
point,
good.
But real quick, so Simon and Peter were the fishermen.
Yeah.
Simon and Andrew were the fishermen.
Right.
James and John were John the Baptist's followers that he stole away from. Is that right?
I don't.
Sons of Thunder.
I don't think they were follow. I don't.
Somebody,
So,
he grabbed a couple of John the Baptist.
There were some John the Baptist followers. I forget
And then,
which
of course,
ones.
Matthew was the tax collector.
I think.
Where did these other guys come from, and which ones never ever appear again?
Yeah.
Which ones vanish?
So
We know what happened to Judas the Iscariot,
Right.
but some of these never appear in Acts or anything.
Yeah, and there are something you can do too is you can also
I guess
look.
I could
You can look at Acts, and you can also look at the early tradition of the church, because there's some things that we can fill in a little
You
bit.
know, Andrew, some of them went off, and there's
Yeah.
history of them going to Africa or
Yeah.
going to the east,
Yeah.
wherever.
And there's traditions of all of the 12. There are traditions about certainly about how they ended their life. They were all martyred, with the exception of John, who was exiled in prison in Patmos. He was the only one that, as far as we know, died of old age.
Like Judas, the son of James.
Yeah. So
I never can't even remember
I think
that there were
maybe.
two Judases, right?
Forgive me. This. I want to say. Oh gosh, somebody whip out their Googler, because I'm wondering if Saint Jude
Oh, okay.
is
It's Judas.
maybe
This Judas.
could be
As in the author of the book, of Jude, is that?
maybe. I'm not
He's
under.
not, he wasn't one of the apostles.
Y'all, please forgive me for not having this info at my fingertips.
Did you-
I'm failing you.
Is it over there?
Okay, what do you wanna know?
Yeah, look up.
Jude was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus according to the New Testament, is what Google says.
Okay, and Jude, aka the other.
It had to have been son of James. It wasn't the other one.
Yeah. So it's Jude, aka Judas.
He is generally identified with Thaddeus,
Yeah, Thaddeus,
and
right?
also has variously been called Jude of James, Jude of Thaddeus, Judas Thaddeus, or another one I'm not going to say.
And there is some confusion too, especially when we get to so with the name James, there are at least 2 Jameses in the New Testament, perhaps 3.
Right. This says Jude of James is the brother of Jesus in this thing.
Yeah.
Matthew and Mark both say that.
Which of course we could get into a whole
Right.
can of worms as far as what exactly what was the exact familial relationship there.
Okay, so Jude the apostle. I guess.
Yeah.
All right, I get it.
They said that they, when they were translating from the Greek, they changed the name Judas Thaddeus,
Okay.
became known as Jude.
Okay, that's
So,
helpful. Yeah.
The difference between Jude,
Right.
Judas Thaddeus, and Judas Iscariot.
It's like if you guys ever read like a Dostoevsky, how he always there's like several names for one person. Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, interesting stuff. Okay, I'll tell you what. We're gonna get right up to the edge here. Here's what we're gonna do. Are you guys ready for some homework? Let me just read the setup here, and then I'm just gonna read the next few verses real quick.
And then I'll sing you.
And he came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. So among the people, we've got not only the greater following of Jesus, the disciples, we also have people coming around from various areas to hear what this guy has to say and to perhaps be healed as well. And the crowd sought to touch him, for power came out from him and healed them all. People want to get in on this. So now here's where the homework kicks in, okay? I want you to, and this won't be hard, I want you to read, at some point over this week, I want you to read the Beatitudes, as well as the pronouncement of woes in verses 24 through 26, and compare that with the beginning of Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 5. Does that make sense? So compare the Beatitudes in Luke with the Beatitudes in Matthew, because they're a little bit different, and think about the theological points that both authors might be making. Can we do that? Yeah. So again, it's Matthew chapter 5 and Luke chapter 6. That's where you can find that material. Matthew chapter 5, Luke chapter 6. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
And we'll get into the meat of it next Sunday, and it's gonna be fun. So thank you guys for bearing with me through this, and we'll get into the meat of the Sermon on the Plain next time. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
We can do a little side by side. That's a great idea. Good idea.